So the embargo for the next Diablo 4 expansion, Lord of Hatred, was just lifted, meaning any of the review sites or anybody with a review copy can now release their reviews of this expansion, which also includes a bunch of new information and a bunch of new footage that gives us even more information. So we have just gotten a mountain of new info for this expansion, and make sure to subscribe because I am going to be doing a ton of videos coming up here on a ton of this new information. But what I want to go over today is the new endgame skill tree for layer bosses, because there is essentially a new system within some of these skill points that will completely change up how layer bosses are, and will also essentially be adding uber versions of boss fights into the game. Now, we don't have all of the nodes for these skill trees, or I just wasn't able to find them anywhere. I was looking at some places that were aggregating all the information that was just released, because there's so many different places releasing information. So I was able to find a good handful of these, but still not all of the skill points that will be available for this specific skill tree. We got to take a look at some very interesting pieces. So I'm just going to go through these nodes and try to order them from what section of the skill tree they're going to be in. We do also have a few nodes at the end that I don't know where they're actually placed, because the image of them is just the node and it doesn't actually show the tree, and those are also quite interesting. So starting on the left side of the tree, in fact, the first node on the most left side of the tree, we have a layer of runes. So layer bosses now have +1 monster power, and layer bosses have a higher chance of dropping specific runes. Now, my assumption with this is that every layer boss is going to have a certain amount of runes dedicated to them that they drop at a higher drop rate for this specific node. So kind of like how uniques are specific to a layer boss, my assumption is that runes with this node will also work in that way. And also, monster power is a new system with the expansion. It also has a tooltip here that says that monster power increases a monster's life, damage, experience, and rewards. So it basically just buffs up the monster in all ways, but gives you a lot more of rewards for every piece of that. And again, this is the first node, so a very low investment, but also pretty good for a first node for getting more loot. Then further down in the left side tree, we have a layer of plenty. Layer bosses have +1 monster power. Presumably a lot of the nodes on this left side are going to give that, but then gain +1 horde chest when you slay a layer boss. Now, horde chests are just what they're calling the chests at the end of layer bosses. So the tooltip reads, horde chests appear when a layer boss is slain. You must provide a layer boss key to claim your reward. And layer boss keys are being changed going into the expansion. Instead of specific materials for each boss, there will just be a layer boss key for like the starter bosses, and then there will be a greater layer boss key for, say, Duriel. So you're not going to have any boss specific materials anymore, but the horde chests are just the chests you open at the end. And if you go down the left side of the tree, which will take some investment, and get this node, that layer boss will now have multiple chests at the end. Now, presumably you will have to use multiple keys for those, but this will be super nice to just speed up layer boss farming. If you're just trying to go through and use all of your keys, going down the left side tree will probably be the best, because you'll just have to do half the amount of boss kills as normal. Now, these next nodes are going to be a little bit different, because there are multiple sections of the layer boss skill tree that are labeled with green nodes, and what it seems to be is a lot of these green nodes are things that are adding layer bosses to other pieces of content. In previous information we got for some of these skill trees, we get to see one where the Beast in Ice can spawn as an additional boss in a Nightmare Dungeon. So you'll be facing the Nightmare Dungeon boss and the Beast in Ice, and when you kill him, he can drop uniques that he would normally drop. And we also got to see another one where a layer boss could randomly spawn in when you're in a Nightmare Dungeon. So these green nodes seem to be adding layer bosses to other pieces of content. So the first one we got to see is Varshan's Vengeance. Varshan and his minions can now appear in a chaos wave within the Infernal Horde. So these are the purple waves that are random random, but when you choose them, they're super juiced. After killing Varshan in the Infernal Hordes, the Spoil of Greater Equipment may drop unique items available from his Horde chest. So now, if you're in an Infernal Horde run and you choose a Chaos Wave, it can spawn Varshan and his minions, and then at the end, when you open up the chest that gives a bunch of loot, it can also just give you a bunch of unique drops from Varshan specifically. Then the next green node is Blood of Bartok. The Fel Consul in the Infernal Hordes has +1 monster power. So again, that'll just make them harder but give them more rewards. After defeating the Fel Consul, the Spoils of Greater Equipment may drop unique items associated with Bartok. And I'm also not sure what specific unique items would be associated with Bartok, but my presumption is that there will just be certain unique items that are tied to Bartok, just like the other layer bosses. And Bartok may be his own layer boss now as well, but I'm not sure on that. So again, these green nodes are just adding the possibility of layer bosses going into other content and you being able to get the rewards that you would normally get just from the layer bosses. So this is also quite interesting. If you're not super fond of just doing layer bosses, you can go for all the green nodes and just add layer bosses to other content. But then we have the really interesting part, which is kind of why I wanted to make this video, and this is the middle section. So this middle section is seeming to be a bit unique compared to the other sections of the tree. So starting off, and I think this is the first node, we have 2x2. After opening a Horde chest, there is a low chance a portal will open that will take you to the Nemesis layer, where you will fight 2 Initiate layer bosses at the same time. Slaying both will yield great rewards. Now there's 2 things with this. I don't know if the Nemesis layer is just what they're calling the area you go to where these 2 bosses are, and I don't know what Initiate layer bosses specifically are. I'm assuming that Initiate layer bosses are like the starter tier of layer bosses that would take the normal layer boss keys, and then things like Duriel and Endariel would be considered something different, but again, I'm not 100% sure on that. But this is just a chance after defeating any layer boss that there's a portal to take you to a room with 2 layer bosses in it, that if you defeat both of them, you just get some massive juiced up loot reward. Then what is seeming to be the node below that is Greater Nemesis. After completing a Nemesis layer, there is a chance that a portal will appear that will take you to a Greater Nemesis layer. Within this heinous place lies 2 greater layer bosses. So slaying both bosses will yield great rewards. So this seems to just be the upgraded version of 2x2. Based upon this, it seems that these Nemesis layers are just the layers you go to that have 2 bosses in them, and if you get the first Nemesis layer and defeat it, you then have a chance to go into a Greater Nemesis layer, which will have 2 greater layer bosses. And again, I'm assuming that the Initiate layer bosses are the first tier of bosses, the greater layer bosses, Duriel tier of bosses. So you'd be going in and facing like Duriel and Endariel, and if you defeat both of those, you will then again get a massive juiced up loot reward. But then we have the craziest part, Ultimate Nemesis. After defeating all bosses within the Greater Nemesis layer, the Call of Evil will appear. This altar will accept 5 Betrayer's Husk, so these are the things to summon Belial, and open a portal that takes you to the Ultimate Nemesis layer. That is also colored in the unique color, and inside the Ultimate Nemesis layer, all enemies gain a +5 monster power, which based upon what we've seen seems absolutely crazy. Defeating the boss encounter will award you with 10 Horde chests worth of items. Also, this says 10 Horde chests worth of items. So this will not cost resources besides the 5 husks you need to get in. And what's also really interesting is this doesn't name a boss. Obviously, this has something to do with Belial, I would assume. They're calling this a boss encounter. They're saying all enemies within. So presumably this is some unique boss fight that has like ad phases or something, or has other things spawning in. It's all super juiced up in difficulty. It has a cost requirement of those Betrayer's Husks, but then you just get the most absurdly juiced loot out of this. And this is basically adding a new system into the game. So you're essentially doing Uber versions of these boss fights. It's not necessarily Uber versions because you're facing multiple bosses instead of like one juiced up version of that boss, but they're essentially Uber boss fights because obviously having 2 bosses with both their mechanics is going to be crazy, especially when you get to like Duriel and Endariel or something. Like they'll have some pretty crazy mechanics just all going off at the same time with super big juiced rewards. But what's also super interesting when you go back through these nodes, how it's actually really explain, because it seems like getting to the ultimate nemesis layer is actually going to be pretty RNG intensive, because you go back to 2x2, which is the chance to go into the initiate boss layer. It is a low chance to get that initiate boss layer. Once you defeat that and you have the greater nemesis node, there is just a chance to get into the greater nemesis layer. And based upon how it's described, there's probably a much higher chance to get the greater nemesis layer after getting the nemesis layer. So I'd presume that getting the nemesis layer is pretty rare. Getting the greater nemesis layer after defeating the normal nemesis layer is probably going to be a much higher chance. And then after you defeat the greater nemesis layer, it seems that it's just guaranteed to get the ultimate nemesis layer. But going into the nemesis layer, then also getting the greater nemesis layer, seems like it's going to have quite a bit of RNG with it. That will just feel like the most juiced proc ever in Diablo 4. Getting those two initial procs and then having the resources to do the ultimate nemesis layer and having the build strong enough to be able to do it, and then just getting your 10 horde chest worth of items at the end, which is just going to be absurdly juiced. So again, this is really the reason I want to go over these new nodes we got to see, because this is essentially a completely new system in the end game layer boss system that is just super interesting, and just having this chance to get these super juiced versions of boss fights will just make farming these layer bosses much more exciting. Now, like I mentioned, there were 2 other nodes I found, but it was just the nodes themselves, so I don't know where these go in the skill tree, but based upon the color of the icon, I think these are nodes that are at the bottom of the skill tree, because even in the green sections of the layer boss skill tree, at the very bottom, there are the more brown nodes. So my presumption is that that's what these are. These are some of the nodes at the very bottom. So the first one is Golden Horde. All equipment that will drop from Horde chests are converted to gold, except for unique and mythic items. Now, this is quite weird, because usually doing layer bosses, pretty much all of the items from these Horde chests are unique. So I'm presuming there is some change to the actual loot you get from layer bosses, presumably being that you're not just getting uniques or the random mythic out of it. You're probably getting a lot more of other rarities, also making me think that uniques at a baseline are much more rare than they've been previously in Diablo 4, at least since the layer bosses have been introduced into the game. But this is also one of those nodes that you'll probably be using if you're really looking to farm up gold. This would probably give you a good amount of gold if there's a node specifically for it. Then the other node is Exotic Armory. Horde chests drop 1 additional unique item, but it can be for any class. So this is quite interesting. You just get more uniques. So this is probably one that you would always be taking no matter what, because if it's an additional unique, even if it's for any class, you still have a like 1 in 8 chance to get an additional unique for your class. So this seems like a node that if it's not super hard to invest into, you'd probably just always want to take, because it's just additional loot. And what's also really interesting is I'm wondering if the loot from the nemesis layers are still considered to be dropping out of Horde chests. Based upon the description, it sounds like it is. So if you took this node and you went in and defeated an ultimate nemesis layer, you would actually be getting just 10 additional unique items that can be for any class. So mixing this with some of the other nodes within this tree could seemingly be absolutely crazy, even though they wouldn't always be uniques for your class. But that's pretty much all I wanted to go over for the layer boss skill tree. Like I mentioned, going down this middle section and getting these 3 nodes pretty much just adds in a completely new system, being the new nemesis layer system into layer bosses, is just such a cool new addition to the game. This is essentially just adding like an uber boss variant of these bosses, and this is legitimately a pretty big new addition to the layer boss system. I'm surprised this is something that officially we haven't gotten revealed at any point yet. And my presumption being that if there's something this crazy in the layer boss skill tree, there's probably other things really crazy for all of the other skill trees. This definitely made me more excited for these endgame meta progression skill trees, just because of how absolutely crazy these specific nodes can become, and just getting to this ultimate nemesis layer boss and defeating all of it and getting the absurd absurd, juiced loot drops from it. It's just going to be such a good experience. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.